Hey guys, Michael Manticon here, and this is The Other Side of the Desk, a podcast that talks about special education, disability empowerment, and inclusion from the viewpoint of someone who has been on both sides of the desk in special education, both as a special education student and now soon to be a special education teacher. Today, we're talking about the subject of autism in schools. Specifically, we are going to explain how autism shows up in school settings. We're going to clarify what schools can do versus what they often do. We're going to introduce special education concepts without overwhelming listeners, and we're going to set the stage for deeper future episodes, such as topics including IEPs, inclusion, burnout, and accommodations. Let's get started. So let's start by saying this. Autism does not exist in a vacuum. Schools are one of the biggest environments autistic people navigate. I know when I was growing up, school was perhaps the hardest environment to navigate. It just wasn't built with someone neurodivergent like me in mind. And I am so happy to say that that's not really the case nowadays. There is a lot more coexistence between neurotypical ways of thinking and neurodivergent ways of thinking when designing the school setting. And that has been an absolute blessing to see now that I'm on the other side of the desk as a special education professional. So there are still problems, though. A student might cope well at home but struggle at school, or the opposite could be true. But it's important to remember that schools introduce noise, social pressure, difficult transitions, and performance expectations, perhaps more than any other setting in a young autistic person's life. Autism doesn't suddenly appear at school, but school can magnify it. For example, no one knew I had autism until I was evaluated by a school psychologist. Does that mean that I didn't have autism the first 5.5 years of my life? Of course not. But there are special considerations and challenges within the school setting that causes autism to either manifest in a more obvious way or start to present challenges for the young learner. So let's talk about how autism commonly presents in schools. So key areas that schools notice for people on the autism spectrum are social interaction, and this can happen during group work or unstructured time, recess or lunch. This can be a problem for us. It can also be a place where some autistic people do shine, but for the majority of people I've talked to, this is a point of a little bit of trauma from their school experience. Especially unstructured time is hard for us on the spectrum because to interact socially, we often memorize these scripts or try to focus on the right things to say. And when the conversation becomes unstructured, that becomes a lot harder. That doesn't mean group work can't be hard as well. But usually, for me at least, group work was more of a place to shine because it was very obvious and apparent what the objective was. But the point is that people with autism can struggle in one or both of those areas. Another area that people on the autism spectrum often struggle with is sensory processing. This can find its way into the classroom in the form of lights, fluorescent lights, whatever lighting might be in the classroom, and just the atmosphere of the classroom as well. Is it crowded? Is it set up in an optimal way to navigate, or is it harder for someone with autism to navigate and to understand? And that's a great topic for a future episode, so let me know if you're interested in that. Another issue that classrooms can have in the life of someone with autism is where it challenges our executive functioning. In the classroom setting, we have to be organized, have time management skills, and have and not struggle with starting tasks. This is often the first place in an autistic person's life where these skills are really supremely valued. And they're not always skills we have in a similar way as our general education peers. the last thing that presents autism as an issue in school is communication. So a lot of times people with autism have a literal interpretation of a lot of things. Sarcasm doesn't make sense. Sometimes analogies don't make sense. This is hard for us because the classroom in the schoolyard is a place where these things happen for the first time a lot of times, or at least the expectation is higher for us to understand these things. So another thing we have a hard time with is advocating for our needs. It can be hard sometimes to raise your hand and say that something's not working right in the classroom and to try to figure out what the best way forward would be, or to ask a teacher for accommodation or help. I certainly struggled with this. I certainly was not a good advocate for myself at the beginning of my school journey, and I slowly but surely became a better advocate. And this is a important life skill for those on the spectrum. Now, an important reminder is that all of these things I talked about, they're differences. They're not intentional behaviors or defiance. People with autism can be defiant. It's not like we can't. We're human. We can have any of the same displays that any other human can have. But these things, if you see them exhibited in a student with autism, you should automatically give the benefit of the doubt unless there's further information. There's also the myth of the obvious autistic student. Not all autistic students are nonverbal. All of them flap hands in STEM in different ways. Not all of them have visible meltdowns. Many of us are masking, we're over-complying, or we're burning out quietly. Some of the most struggling students are the ones who look fine. Remember that. Sometimes it is true that the squeakiest wheel gets the oil. And though certainly as a special education teacher, I flock towards students who I can tell are having issues, I also want to flock towards students that may not be getting my attention in the midst of those issues. So that's always something to keep in mind as an educator or a future educator. So what are things that schools typically do? What interventions? And why are these interventions coming up with mixed results? And why are they complicated? So let's start out by the idea that schools are entities that are bound by laws, documentation, and limited resources, and that support often comes through IEPs, 504 plans, and special education services. This does not inhibit greatness in terms of a special education program or in terms of just an overall classroom, but it does dictate that support will depend heavily on staff understanding, school culture, caseload size, and training. These are very important points, and you should keep them in mind as you look at your workplace if you work in education and see, am I getting the right training? Am I getting a good caseload? Am I getting staff that understand or who I can train to better understand the situations? Is the school culture good related to disability empowerment? And if you can't remedy or change these overnight, how can you start sowing the seeds for them to manifest? So also when you're thinking of that, know that autism does not automatically mean that the student needs to be in a separate classroom, that they need one-to-one aides, or that they need to be in a special school. Definitely not that. Most students with autism can do perfectly fine in the school where they're based with their other peers, and it actually helps them because they have their other peers as mentors and models. So I want you to think more in terms of special education. Think of general education with supports, resource support or RSP, as we call it in California, special day classes, or combination models. The goal isn't placement, it's access. We don't go into this thinking, oh, wouldn't it be great if we place them there? Wouldn't that provide the maximum help that they need? No, we're thinking what they need in the least invasive way possible to have the same or similar school experience in terms of equitable education as any other student. As a former student, I know what it feels like to be misunderstood. I know what it feels like to be placed in the wrong class for me. I know what it feels like to not be in a school with a good culture around special needs and where staff and peers are not taught. Those with autism can be friends, they can be great people, they have a difference, but it doesn't mean they have a weakness. So I grew up like that, and I grew up in a setting where a lot of times things were not just right, and there is a sense that nothing will ever be entirely right, but we can always push forward and do better and better in special education. So as a future teacher and as someone who's currently working in special education, I see the constraints educators work under. I've gained much more of a sympathy for teachers who may have done the wrong thing when I was a kid. And I've learned that it's hard, it's hard on both sides of the aisle and on both sides of the desk, but we try to make it better each day. Know that good intentions don't always equal good outcomes. We must be science-based, there must be proper documentation, and we must put ourselves in their shoes, not just sympathy, but empathy for those with autism. And that's something I try to do in this podcast as someone with autism, is try to give you a dual perspective on this. And also, I would like to preach forgiveness for anyone who had hurt me when I was younger, going through special education, because I know that it's hard. Now that I'm a teacher, it's hard to do right by every student every time. And I know I'm bringing up a lot of things that prompt more questions than answer them in this episode, but that's because I don't have all the answers, and no one does. What's important is awareness and putting the power in educators' hands to come up with unique solutions for tomorrow. That being said, here are some things that actually help autistic students at school. Predictability is very important. Predictability is amazing, and when it's implemented in a classroom, makes things much easier. Putting forward routines that make it where there's no guesswork involved, but there's actually a lot of trust and confidence in what's going on, that we can build scripts and memorization around our environment, and we don't have to do that extra processing or use our extra executive functioning to solve problems we don't understand. With that, clear expectations is another one that is so important. I couldn't tell you how many times I've seen it both as a student and as an educator where the expectation is not clear, or there may be one expectation here and another expectation there. And that's hard. It's hard because it's hard for the students, but it's also hard for the staff. And I do not think anyone's at fault when this happens, but just better training and better understanding of how the special education system ought to work for students can go a long way in remedying this. Sensory breaks are so important. And sensory breaks are the type of thing where if you're in a foundations classroom or a moderate severe classroom, they're very well known, very common. And as you start to get further and further what would stereotypically be called up on the spectrum, even though the spectrum is not high or low functioning, when you start getting to more essentials or mild moderate classes, these things start to wane a little bit. And that's really unfortunate. It's another case of the squeakiest wheel getting the oil. And it's important for students who need to get their sensory needs out to get them. Some students will need a natural sensory room on the campus. Others will definitely just maybe need a walk in the beginning of the day to reset for the day's activities. Another thing that's important is respectful communication. I've heard it said that it takes 5 nice comments to regain trust in a student after giving one critique. So critiques are natural and normal and have to happen for students to grow. But we must also be proactive in finding the things that our students do well and saying it right to their face. Just as quickly or even quicker than we do all the things that they may be doing wrong. And then adults who listen is the final important thing to emphasize. It's important for adults to be there, not just on their own program, even if their program is trying to help the student. Sometimes entering into a student's world, like I do a lot in the morning, I just talk to the student. And there might be stuff to do, but I intentionally make some time to enter into that student's world. And even if they're talking about the most seemingly nonsensical thing, I make some time to listen. So accommodations don't lower standards, and I would never preach for lowered standards in special education. I believe in holding students to their highest standards. They just remove the barriers for them to reach those high standards. So the key takeaway is that autism in schools isn't just an education issue, it's a human one. We might talk in later episodes about what an IEP really is, inclusion versus compliance, autism burnout in students, the role of aides and teachers, and being autistic and working in education like I'm doing right now. But I would like you to know that at the end of the day, when schools understand autism better, students don't have to work so hard just to exist. So again, let me know if this was helpful to you and any subjects you'd like covered in the future other than the ones I brought up. And it was a great pleasure to talk with you today. May you go forth and always uphold the individuality and the humanity of people with all abilities. Thank you.